Dr. Diane Forbes, Berthoud, thank you so much for coming and sharing your wisdom, insights, and brilliance about how can faculty, particularly white faculty, begin to recognize where are their implicit biases that might be into their practice, and proactively, how can they create a more racially inclusive syllabi, coursework, practices. So I can't wait. And for folks that don't know you, currently the Assistant Vice Chancellor for
Associate now. Got
I,
promoted.
I didn't know. I'm writing it down. Congratulations.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
And I'm assuming that means your portfolio continues to expand.
Yeah, which is all good. Yes. Thank you.
At University of California, San Diego, we've had a chance to interact and work together a couple times. But the reason I asked you to come, particularly to talk about faculty, cross-racialized identity, mostly white, to how to use a race lens in everything you do, is as an associate professor and chair. That got my attention, communication at Trinity University, because you've been doing faculty development in many ways, informally as chair, formally as well as in your current role. But you've been professor at, let me see if I got them all, George Mason, University of Maryland, College Park, go Terps, all my family went there, Georgetown, and then master's and doctorate from Howard.
HU.
Did I miss any organizations where you've done faculty development, especially around using a race lens, dismantling racism?
Those are the main ones. And some of those were faculty appointments, and the Georgetown and the College Park ones were fellowships. And so while I was at Trinity or while I was at Howard, had opportunities to be elsewhere. So it's been a great privilege. Yes, thank you. You got it all.
So I can't wait for you to share your insights and wisdom. And so I will follow you.
Okay.
But if we could talk proactively, because I hear people say decolonizing the curriculum, use issues of race and racism into everything you do as faculty. So whether it's syllabus, assignments, learning materials, what suggestions, wisdom, do's and don'ts do you have for faculty that are passionate and wanting more ideas about being proactive?
Great. Thank you for the question, Kathy, and thank you for having me and contributing to this conversation. One of the things that I thought about when you mentioned or sent the question to me about how do we infuse race or add it in, I actually rethought that, and I thought we could trouble it a little bit, if I could say it that way. And for our colleagues listening, the infusion and the adding in is helpful, but what I think is most productive and beneficial is a reconstruction of our thinking, of our pedagogy, of our histories, if you will. And so one of the first things that I would certainly recommend to departments and in faculty development is to strive to develop a common and a deeper understanding of what we mean when we say decolonizing the curriculum or an anti-racist curriculum, or what we mean when we talk about inclusive pedagogy or pedagogies. And the common and deeper understanding comes from a few things. Focusing and thinking about what race is, not what we think per se, but what does the research tell us? What do we know from history scholars, ethnic studies scholars, political science scholars, and becoming familiar. So although we might be in faculty roles or leadership roles, becoming students again and becoming familiar with individual, institutional, and structural racism. Really important to think about how what happens at the individual level is then connected to what happens at the institutional. In this case, it might be your individual institution, university of, you name it, or college, so and so, and how that fits into, if you will, the structural elements of education, healthcare, economics, and so on. While this might seem too broad and too extensive in what we're doing, it's very much where higher education, knowledge creation are located. And so if we're not aware of the systems within which we're embedded and find ourselves, we're going to be repeating the same kinds of things. So with those things in mind, becoming a student of history and political science and social dynamics and so forth, then we come to thinking about one's own curriculum and one's pedagogy. And, from an equity perspective, as well as a relationship building perspective, I say, who do you know who's an expert in these areas? Seek these people out on your campus, off your campus, in your homes, in your communities. So who are the professional and personal relationship experts, if you will, in these areas? So maybe the community member or your neighbor or, another friend that you have from another racial, ethnic, cultural group is not an expert in pedagogy. But developing those relationships actually will help in your thinking and your understanding, as well as in the reduction of bias, consciously and unconsciously. What the psychological research shows is bias isn't necessarily decreased by getting more training. Don't get me wrong. On our campus, we actually offer trainings, workshops. You've been a part of those as well. In fact, you've been more a part of an initiative than a training, and you'll be coming back a few more times to University of California, San Diego, and we thank you for that. It is the increased interaction that in fact decreases bias and decreases the chasms, if you will, or the gaps between cultural, racial, ethnic groups. And that is part of what informs our pedagogy. And so it does feel as if, gosh, that's a lot of work for me to do. Yes, it is. And with the commitment to this decolonization and this commitment to a student-centered approach, this is work that we will have to do. I'll briefly mention this, and I know people want to hear about tools and those kinds of things. I will get there. But the way that I think about this is not just checkboxes, it's not one-off, it's not do's and don'ts necessarily. It's all of those things. And it is context setting, it is thinking about history, it is examining oneself within that history and then moving forward. So it means becoming comfortable with thinking, learning, reading, knowing more about anti-Blackness or anti-Blackness, depending on where you're from and how you think about that, right? It is thinking not only about unconscious bias and discrimination, but also thinking about how aware am I and my failure to act in particular situations. So that would actually be individual anti-Blackness. You know, the prejudice, the unconscious bias, the discrimination, some of the more overt things that we can find, we can point to and say, you left this person out, or you spoke over that other person, or I did this and I ignored that one, or did this, made a joke about this. That's individual anti-Blackness. And we can easily recognize that. But we don't as easily recognize the lack of awareness and our inability or our failure to act. That is also individual anti-Blackness. It's just letting it go by. We see, we hear the thing, we experience it in our midst. It's like the Me Too movement. Other persons in the organization who saw that but never said anything. And then, of course, there's institutional with the policies and so forth. So thinking about the relationships then to pedagogy, I'll get to some of that, and then we can always loop back on some of the points that I made earlier. It will be important for departments and for faculty to ask what constitutes an inclusive curriculum, or what constitutes an anti-racist agenda, if you will. And it's thinking about all the things that I mentioned contextually, structural, institutional, individual anti-Blackness, understanding race more deeply, increasing our awareness, listening, watching stories, developing relationships with people so people can actually share with us what just happened to me at the grocery store, that I might have been profiled here, or this experience with the police, or in my department. It took me 7 years to get tenure, and I believe it's because I publish on X, and it has to do with ethnic, cultural, different orientation groups, international groups, etc. And that's marginalized in my department. Let's understand what that means, right? So as it comes to the curriculum then and asking these questions, I am suggesting doing some work in and around knowledge, power, structure, and history in the curriculum. And so decolonizing, that means we commit to doing something similar to what we would call a course audit. You know, looking at your courses, looking at what you're constructing. So I know we're into the semester for some people, or the quarter for others. Never too late to learn, and never too late to take a look. And if you've already taken a look, take a second and third look. So here are some of the elements that I'd like to highlight in terms of the nuts and bolts, if you want to get to that. And I'll go back to broader principles of decolonizing the curriculum, because we need both and, the more specific and the broad. So the curriculum and the syllabi. Are the reading lists inclusive? What are the priorities and what are the themes covered in that area? Now, because I'm a social scientist and I have a background in communication and also have done work in social psychology, it's easier for me to include things in and around identity-based conflict, identity-based issues in politics and so forth. So a course that I might offer on leadership development that has to do with all these other intersections may not be as relevant in this conversation, but it could still be. Look at the reading list. Who are the authors that I'm going to choose for this? Particularly in an area such as women's leadership development or leadership studies, both can be white and or male, right? So even when we talk about women in leadership, most of the scholarship, outside of some of my colleagues and I who've written about these areas, most of the scholarship is written by white women, mostly, or white men. So then taking a look at the reading list, who are the authors? And I know it's going to take extra work, but this is what it means to decolonize the curriculum, as well as what it means to be anti-racist. And I'll go into more detail about anti-racism in a moment. So look at the reading list, how old those readings are, because persons who published in 1985, 1995, even 2005 will have a different orientation, a different sets of philosophies. And they are important. I know you were a history major, Kathy, so I won't offend you. They are important as a foundation. And sometimes we'll say these are the seminal readings of the field. Even examine that and trouble that. What makes that seminal? Were there other authors from other regions of the country or the world, from other racial, ethnic, cultural groups, other genders, other perspectives that have written about these issues? So examining the reading list really with a fine-tooth comb, right? And going back through Google to see who were these people, who are they, what perspectives did they bring, what philosophies or theoretical frameworks did they advance? And then as we're teaching these courses, what are the priorities or the themes that we will highlight? Do we tell the stories of Black, Indigenous people of color? Do we tell the stories of people who are non-binary? Do we tell the stories of people who are not from the United States? Leadership is not just about what happens here, or political processes are not just about the US Constitution, for example. Do we tell the stories from the perspective of Indigenous peoples in the United States who've been assaulted, raped, destroyed, abused, the list goes on, right? Do we also tell those stories, or are we telling the stories of missions and the stories of the ways in which these people were made better people? We cut their hair, we made them more Europeanized, we made them truly American. Let's trouble that idea of what is American if you're in a social science class or a history class or something like that, all right? So we could go on there, even in STEM fields. I'll give you some examples on those, because on our campus, we have a number of STEM colleagues. I'll just give some engineering examples. And also I can give some medical examples. When we're studying breast cancer, or when we are studying tuberculosis, when we're studying COVID, right? Who are our participants and which populations are highlighted? And what knowledge do we say is generalized when we talk about breast cancer, COVID, or headaches, or migraines, or whatever it is, right? Cognitive development. Whose norms are made central in that? And really thinking about that. And one might say, which is very true in some of these fields, well, there aren't many women in these fields, or there aren't many people of color who study these things. There may not be many. Students, however, need to be exposed to these, and we in our faculty and leadership roles need to highlight those. So curriculum, syllabi, and so on. The other thing is, from time to time, we'll invite guests to our classroom, right? We might bring in someone who serves a government class. We might bring someone who's on the city council. We might bring someone who's done legislative work or lobbying or whatever it is. Who are those persons? Because it's both that we're sharing the knowledge, but we're also sharing the experience. And if I sit in the class as a faculty member or as a student of color, a Black woman, and I never see anyone who is even closely aligned to any of the 59,000 identities I might hold at any given point, I begin to say, well, I don't think I can serve in government in those roles, or I don't think I can be a professor, or I don't think I could be a paleontologist or whatever, or whoever you bring to the class. So the guests that we bring, not only in terms of representation and identity, but same thing as the readings, the perspectives, the curricula, and those kinds of things. And I'll mention some more, and then I'll pause, Kathy, for any reflections or thoughts from you. Then media. Pictures that we might use, films that we might show, examples we give in literally the visual texts. What are the visual texts? And I don't just mean textbook. I mean what they see in images, things we assign, because whatever they see normalizes the experience of that. So if we talk about travel, and if we talk about political life, if we talk about disease, whatever pictures and texts and videos and podcasts and webinars and things that we show or share, say, this is the experience of life, of the world. And if a student or any learner or any participant in the learning environment feels external to that, we have already done a disservice, and this may in fact impact their academic performance, because well-being, esteem, engagement in the learning environment are all aspects that tell us what that B or that B minus or C or D or A meant. The more engaged, the more closely identified student is more likely to have the academic success, but not only that, have a positive learning experience. And similarly, with case studies, the case studies we choose, who are the people who are highlighted in those? Even the names of the people. Is it just Jane, Mary, and John? Or do we have Juan? Do we have Akbar? Do we have Mimi? Do we have Haishi? Do we have Xingping? Do we have those names and people? So people say, oh, I know somebody who lived there, where I lived in China or where I lived in Ghana or something. Now you have to find every country, every person, every ethnicity, but to think through who the people are in those case studies, which organizations are highlighted, and what causes do those organizations stand for. So case studies. And then the final 2 or 3 are lived experiences. To what extent do we bring in inclusive lived experiences of our faculty and students or staff in that learning environment? I have shared stories before. I'm not saying I cover everything for every class, but I have been in a communication and leadership class, and I have told quite often, and I've been privileged to travel because of my research and my work, the story of traveling to Brazil to present at a conference on what it was the Caribbean and Latinx communities at that time, the Caribbean Studies Association and Latin Studies Association. And my paper was going to be a women of color in leadership. And so I was there to present on that, but also use that as an opportunity to learn about the surrounding communities where we were presenting and to learn about some of the local traditions and so forth. So I was there for a while. In Brazil, they speak Portuguese. I am a good enough Spanish speaker. And even as an adult, even as a faculty member, I went to Brazil thinking, I got this. I've gone to Spanish speaking countries before. I have been to Panama. I have been here. I've lived in Miami, and all of these people sometimes mistake me for a Latinx woman. And I'm like, I got this. I go there and I realize, first of all, the Portuguese is a little different from in this era that I stayed, because there were more peoples of color and more indigenous communities in the favelas, which is like the barrio and Latin communities. And the second thing is, where we stayed did not have very many formally educated people. So even when I switched to English, they were kind of looking at me like, what are you saying? And then the Spanish that I knew that I was trying to use there didn't fly either. But the arrogance of me to think that my Spanish that I learned from Spanish speakers from Spain or Cuba or different countries, actually, that my Spanish would be good enough there, and that I didn't even need to learn Portuguese or, learn beyond a few please, thank you, and you're welcome kinds of things. And I had many other interesting adventures that in another conversation I can share, but I have used that example in class to talk about presumptions about culture, about races, about peoples, and also about, even as an educated woman, so to speak, I went there thinking I knew stuff. And students kind of chuckle out like, oh, Dr. Forbes, you should have known, and this kind of thing. But the more important lesson here is I shared an experience about traveling to a country or a part of the country with mostly people of color and international settings. So I raised up some race issues, ethnicity issues, some geopolitical issues. I was able to cover some cultural issues. And so I never pulled out a book or anything. I just shared my lived experience of my own arrogance and the importance of studying languages and knowing peoples through those languages. And there's so many other examples I can think of there, going to Germany and getting off at Dusseldorf, and German is like, it's not great. But through nonverbal communication, someone was able to point to where I needed to go, nodding and smiling. I was like, thank you. I did a thumbs up. I smiled. I did a few things to then offer a lesson about nonverbal communication. And so I brought that German experience in. And of course, I lived all throughout the United States. What do we share about those experiences? And how many students can we touch with? If I only gave golf examples, or only gave classical music examples, or only gave lacrosse examples or volleyball examples, which my children have played and that kind of thing, and I've played classical and been trained, that leaves out a whole group of people. But if I also talk about, some of the things that I just mentioned, going to Brazil, being from Jamaica, speaking other dialects, living in Washington, D.C. for a long time, being in a family of color, I begin to touch on 2 or 3 or 4 areas that might include my students. And it's less about drawing them to me, and it's more about expanding the learning experience so that it is truly inclusive. So sources of knowledge and values need to be examined, and then the learning environment we'd like to create. I'll pause there. We can talk about decolonizing the curriculum a little bit more. This is so exciting to me, Kathy.
Love your wisdom. And I love how you use what I call self as instrument. So personal stories.
Yeah.
What white dominant culture says, be impersonal and just use research from white people. Mm-hmm. The power of storytelling. And you particularly talked about privilege and marginalized power dynamics with, tell me I'm wrong, your privilege as at that point, a U.S. Relative. I don't know your citizenship today.
I was a citizen. At the time
I thought so. You might be dual. So
right.
Citizen, and then all your formal schooling, at least 2 of your privileged identities.
I've been here.
The arrogance. And so sometimes folk of color who share some of their privileged identities help particularly white students. Oh, yeah. And the other power of really thinking about representation in all the materials, but also role. And so not having stereotypic representation, or all folks of color in being served, and all the whites in white savior. But to really think, I remember telling folk at one point, if you have 10 examples, make sure 7 of those have folks of color in leadership positions, and have 3 with whites in leadership positions. So instead of the 10 to 0, balance it out. But really, and the only thought I had, Brandon, as you were talking, how could folks get their students to critique the current syllabus, readings, all the assignments with a race intersectional lens? And then one of their 10% homework assignments is, and find more that add to, so that faculty may not feel they have to do it all themselves. But you started with just foundations of race, racism, white supremacy. Okay, so just because of time, we may throw in some more proactive, but I'd love you to now talk a bit about, so all of this proactive work, white particularly, but any faculty could still have breadth of racialized, minoritized difference and some bias as they do grading, as they maybe do chat and assign, bulletin board, as they advise, who they let do makeups and who they don't, or their tone with somebody. Because I know as a white person, I was always given the benefit of the doubt. I was assumed to always tell the truth. And as a white person, I learned that folks of color were suspicious. They're trying to get away with things. And I think those white supremacist attitudes may still be built into many people. So late assignments, any kind of practice or policy, how could racial bias, stereotypes fuel behaviors that leave students of color, Indigenous students, really feeling microaggressed, as well as I don't belong here, therefore impact maybe student success?
Yeah, so really quickly, I would focus on an equity, have an equity-minded focus here, which is considering where there might be and where there are barriers and disparities for different kinds of students across these racial groups, across these ethnic and cultural groups. And wherever possible, let's educate ourselves about the academic outcomes in K through 12 for Latinx students, for Black students, for Indigenous students, compared to their white counterparts. In California, for example, white and Asian students generally have higher GPAs, have greater outcomes, in terms of persistence and time to graduation, either time to degree or achieving the high school diploma. And then whites and Asians are also more likely to not just attempt the higher ed degree, but to complete it. There may be more stop outs, if you will, for students of color. Now, an equity-minded perspective thinks about, why is that? And we have to move away in our faculty world from individualizing these behaviors or saying, these groups are this way. So when I deal with this individual student, it is because of this larger group dynamic. We have to go farther. And first of all, disarm ourselves of that and challenge that, and think about the structural elements that I mentioned earlier. The under-resourced schools, the underserved schools that many, not all, many of those students are found in terms of their zip code, they're pretty much trapped from poverty to poor achievement in some cases. And we have to be careful not of the achievement gap, yes, but not so much about the opportunity gap and the lack of privilege and standing to which many come to the learning environment, while at the same time they have a great deal of resilience, a great deal of community knowledge, a great deal of get up and go, if you will, and ambition. So thinking about those kinds of things, when we talk about late assignments and advising and policies, examine, Kendi talks about this in terms of being anti-racist, de-racializing behaviors, if that's even possible in the US, but that is a goal, and not necessarily saying this person is doing this because this is a fill in the ethnic group student, right? This is happening if we listen and if we humanize, not dehumanize, but humanize the person, we understand they're experiencing COVID, they're a parent, and they're also caring for their father who just had COVID, right? So then there are 3 or 4, those are the ones I've named. There are probably 15 other factors that are at play. And so the lateness there, maybe, if we ask, maybe that they have these things happening. And if we establish and engender that sense of trust, we might learn more. I'll give you a quick example. I waited for a colleague in a meeting earlier this week. I knew that she had some health concerns. Now, for me, 6, 7, close to 10 minutes late is late. But somehow, because I knew she had these issues, I stayed on the line. I mean, I did my own thing. And she came on the line and said, not on video, I'm sorry I'm not on video. I would like to have this meeting today. My mother passed away suddenly last night. And I'm like I was shocked. First of all, that she even showed up. right? I just thought she would send a text or an email saying, Diane, I'm sorry. She came to the meeting and said, but this is going to be good for me. It will distract me because I have to fly, she has to fly out of state to her mother and all this. And I thought there was a moment I could have easily said, she's not serious. She's not about time. But doesn't she respect me? I could have done that so easily, Kathy. And I had that voice. But I knew from before, a few months back, she had been ill. So I was giving her the benefit of the doubt because of her illness, not knowing. I'm so glad I stayed. And I didn't say, should we reschedule? That thing where you're like, you're too late. Let's do another meeting. And I found that out. And the meeting turned out to be talking about her mother's death. And sometimes with our students, it will look like that, particularly in COVID, with the socioeconomic stressors, with the social stressors, the racial stressors, and the other things. So I put it in that context. That's not every student's story, but I put it in that context to say our students of color tend sometimes to have socioeconomic challenges, are also breadwinners, and are doing the best that they can, and bring a great deal more, in my experience, sometimes the resilience and the ambition and the what we call stick-to-itiveness, the persistence, another way of saying that. So I offer that, and thinking about an equity-minded focus that takes into consideration their barriers and their difficulties in the education process.
So really getting to know their students, whether it's some of those early semester term, here's a Google Doc, fill in whatever you want me to know, it's confidential. And then to your point, even one-on-one, as you're talking about a late assignment, or can I miss the class, or I know I've missed 3 and I don't want to fail. Well, tell me more. And what's the context of the student, and asking questions that aren't interrogating,
right?
But are, tell me more about you, or what's the context you're in. And the other thought that came to me was there and left.
I have one.
Oh,
if it comes.
One is to ask, okay, here's how I just treated this one student of color. Is that similar, different to how I treated the last 2 white students that had a similar request? So whether it's discipline, whether it's discretionary, yes, you can do it, no, you can't.
Yeah.
And just ask, and that could be a real tool for particularly white faculty to go, especially if they take notes, what I did, why, how I was feeling, and then to really compare.
Yeah. With this circumstance and curriculum and some other things, the equitable approach and the anti-racist approach is to co-create the learning environment with students. Not only the storytelling and the curriculum, but this experience that we're talking about special dispensations and accommodations, also mean that we might ask not only some of the things that you mentioned, but also saying, what do you need in this moment? What would be most helpful to you? And students, I find them to be all great. Of course, there are problems dynamically here and there. However, asking what do you need at this time? Sometimes I just need until midnight, or I just need one more day. No, we all, with our experience, hopefully, many of us, I shouldn't say we all, but many of us, I'm sure, can identify where there are genuine problems and identify where a student may not be as motivated and may need some more support. But let's talk about the situation where the student has the personal situation that we're talking about here, or maybe some academic difficulty or something else. And we then ask, what do you need? How can I help you here? And helping them work with us to co-create the solution. So it doesn't necessarily, I get it in faculty role, there's some position, but it doesn't necessarily appear imposed or some kind of abuse of our power or disregard of their condition.
As you're talking, it just hit me, some of these rules, even dispensation, might be really grounded in white supremacy culture. Who said how many late? You're 10 minutes late to class, you don't get credit.
Wow.
And so I wonder if a department, tell me if you've ever heard of this, could look at some of our practices and rules, how that might or may not only in this context, but in general, may not necessarily support engagement, student learning. And are there ways we can anticipate people missing 4 classes? So do we record them, or their makeup exam? I don't have all the answers, but to, in your word, trouble some of these late attendance practices, grammar, get cut off with.
Oh, wow. Yeah. And I mean, COVID has taught us a lot, hasn't it? I hope it has. It's been a great teacher for me. And although I'm not, I'm in the full-time administrator role and not in a day-to-day classroom setting or a lecture hall setting per se, the teaching has been around the life circumstances of others. And although I said co-creating the learning environment, it's really co-creating the higher education environment and future. And when we think about equity, it really is about, one could think about it as process and outcome, where those who've been most affected or traditionally marginalized are a part of creating or receiving the resources and making sure that they're in the power and position to bring about the changes that affect their own lives. So, it's the physician saying, here's what it's going to be, medication for you, and you do this thing, when in fact the person may just want a conversation about the pain they're having and why, and then helping to make a connection perhaps between stress and that thing, and not just medication, paper, here, out the door you go, and so that piece of the availability, the human connection, the curiosity about what people are experiencing, I think, is what needs to happen more in the educational environment, so that we don't start with a blanket statement about any group or person, or, caregivers do this, or parents, so of course it's a woman, so therefore, if we start there, we've already lost, but that think about that sense of mutual gain and mutual benefit, if you will.
As we come to a close, there's so much we could talk about, but I wonder if you can go back to your chair life experience. What structures could chairs implement that might support faculty having peer coaching, peer review, in a real learning? Because I know they could have a learning community. How do you get it, though, in the line? I call it the line of supervision. So they're in faculty meeting. What could you imagine, or what do you know happens that chairs support the structures, or that tenure is created or promotion is created of people who create anti-racist pedagogy, curriculum, really have student engagement? But how can chairs, you could go to deans, but that feels way up here. What could chairs do that might support this kind of reflection, development, reconstruction?
Well, I was thinking a great way to do this is to establish the processes and the practices that advance some of the things that we've been talking about here. So let's go with the course audit. You mentioned peer coaching. I mean, we used to have at one of my institutions a professional development and scholarship committee. And that committee built out, assessed, and instituted a mentor-mentee relationship. So we looked at the CVs of the junior faculty coming in, the ones of the mid-level, mid-tenure, and the more senior faculty, associate and above. And then we're like, okay, this person is interested in the study of this area. So doing a mentor match and having that formal, and in that match happens the mid-tenure review, which is a 3-year review, the course syllabi, talk about conversations about courses, look at the syllabi itself, those kinds of things. What I mentioned earlier about a course audit, that's something that chairs can institute. It doesn't have to be as formal as, we're going to bring an external consultant and then we're going to do this, but it is having a sequence of 6 to 8 questions, which are about some of the things that I mentioned earlier. Media, readings, themes, guests, case studies, textbooks. Do we want to change our textbooks? And that could be working with someone external. It could certainly be internal as well. The other piece is establishing and making very transparent, if it is an institution that's R1 and that has tenure with promotion and so forth, establishing clear guidelines for tenure and promotion that, and I don't want to discard scholarship and research at all, I am myself a researcher, but that also look at areas of diversity and equity, institutionalize it. So it's not like, well, I didn't know I had to do that. Similar to the contributions to diversity statement that many institutions now have for faculty. So, okay, that's the one shot and you got in the door. Year 1, year 2, year 3, come for your mid-tenure review and you are going up for tenure for associate prof, and then you're moving from there to perhaps full professor. What are those equity, diversity, and inclusion, in this case, anti-racist criteria that must be met? And if they must be met and that's transparent and it's a condition for employment and promotion, then we're doing the training on the front end to prepare people for that. It's not going to be a surprise on the day of when you walk into the big room with the big panel, in this case, virtual panel probably for some people, but it will be, it says here, right? Criterion 1, Article 2, or something like that, say the following. And the Western Association of Colleges and Schools, and I think also Middle States, has something similar around diversity education and how are we contributing to a just society? And so in higher education, we have to report on this to Western Association of Schools and Colleges, how we're diversifying society and bolstering critical thinking about diverse populations. So that's institutionalized from our governing or accreditation bodies. And so we then, in a sense, comply or align with those goals. A similar thing needs to happen in higher education, and it can happen at the departmental level as well.
So it's not only high motivated individuals, but to get it into performance, accountability, support.
Yes.
I wish we had more time. Thank you so much, Dr. Diane Berthoud. I learn so much every time we talk.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, Catherine.
Really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you so much. My pleasure.
Take good care.
Okay, you too.